What's going on, everybody? Zach here, and this is another glass blowing tutorial. Today we're making this silver fumed honeycomb marble. I fumed 0.99 fine silver onto Simax, so it's borosilicate glass. This is a 32x4 tube that I'm handling up to with a 10mm blow tube. Just gonna work that seal in nicely so there's no acute angles, so that there's no chance of that falling off the handle while we're working. I'm going to heat up a section and constrict it down so I can break the tube into two pieces. And I'm going to use the corner of my marver here so that I can crack a nice even ring. I'm just going to wiggle that a little bit and stress it out, and it pops right off as long as it's thin enough. Now we've got the octagonal reamer, and we're going to open this up so we can flare it and fume the interior of the tube. Very careful to make sure the edge, the very lip of this, is the hottest part so we don't condense the tube back too much and end up with a thick wave in the wall of the tube. So now that's fumed open, or that's flared open. Now we've got a little bit of silver on the end of a quartz rod. We're going to fume in a neutral to slightly oxidized flame, maybe a touch extra propane to lay the silver on, and then I turn up the oxygen and clean off the surface of the glass a little bit. So that reduces the amount of silver that's going to be able to reduce as you repeatedly fume to apply a little bit more silver and get some of these deeper colors. So once that fuming's done, we're going to close that up. We heat the lip of that tube and close that flare. I use my paddle so that I can kind of stay in the heat and close it relatively quickly at the start. I will use my L marver a little bit, but at the end, here we are just picking that shut. I go around the lip and just continually pull any bit towards the center until it closes up like that and tear away any scrap. Now we're going to heat that up and puff it out so we have a nice round end. And then once that's nice and round, we give it another heat, and we're going to blow it out thin so that we can start applying some dots. So here you see that expansion. I'm going to puff until I have a nice thin wall so that I can start putting the dots onto a thin bubble with silver on the inside. So now we've sped this up to 4 times, just so that I could clip this down from like an hour long. I wanted to speed the dot section up and kind of talk about how the whole process of laying the dots down, having nice even spacing and even sized dots, is just a mix of rhythm and timing and hand-eye coordination. Every so often, if your hands are a little wobbly, you'll land a dot on its neighbor, and that's really going to affect the pattern. So you really want to try and have a methodical kind of approach to laying down each dot after another. I start with a center dot, lay 6 down around it, so you've got the initial 7 of the in the center of the honeycomb, and then we continually just place dots in between each of those previous rows, being sure to heat it up every so often. You got to get back in the flame and warm everything up every so often, just so that the tip of the bubble doesn't end up cracking. If you just keep on going and do all of your dots in one go, every so often you can make it, but chances are the first couple dots are going to start to get really stressed out and you're going to end up with a crack. So now we're heating that up. Sometimes if you do get a crack, you can save it at this point, as long as you use kind of gravity to bring all the glass together. You need to kind of rotate so the crack goes highest on the bubble and it can condense and stop the cracks from opening up. But we're just going to continually heat and puff until we have a nice even wall. You can still see a little bit of waviness from the dots up until the point where that interior wall, right now you can see it start to really be a nice even dome. So then we just continue to put that even heat in and let it condense back using heat, using our L marver a little bit, and just kind of forcing it all to be right in the center. Now I'm just taking a quick second to have a peek at how it's all condensing. It's almost there, just need to give it a little more heat. I'm really trying to focus on heating until the piece condenses enough that the backside is relatively flat. You don't want it to be too much of a concave surface when you pull this away from the rest of the tube, because it'll make it harder for you to condense it and get a nice even back to add some color onto without trapping any bubbles. So you just spend the time here and it saves you a bunch of work later. Yeah, getting back on that L-marver, that helps me kind of chill the tube so that I can let the hotter massive glass that we've condensed continue to condense back without falling into the rest of the tube and condensing more of the tube into the piece that we're making. Yeah, just back and forth from the marver, trying to stop that heat from soaking into the rest of the tube. And now we're getting pretty close. I think I'm gonna grab a handle pretty quick here and put a handle on the center of that the honeycomb we've made. Give it a little more heat before we get there. So now I'm gonna pick up a handle here. So I'm trying to make sure I don't push this handle into the honeycomb too much. I want the honeycomb to be relatively hot, but not enough that I deform the piece that we've already been making. Kind of want to try and preserve that lens. So now we're heating the transition from the tube to the honeycomb. We're going to stretch that out a little bit so we can flame cut the piece away from the rest of that tube we prepped up with silver. So yeah, we've just got a nice focused flame on the center fire, and then I'll puff this out a little bit. So this is a kind of a stretching puff just to get ready to really pull this the rest of the way apart. On the second heat, that's when I flame cut everything away, and I do leave a bubble here often, and I'm just gonna pick that bubble open. It's a little bit of a risky move if you don't know how to keep the heat on the right spot. You can really just keep peeling glass away from the end of your piece if you are too far in the flame when you try and open that up. But yeah, if you open it up right, you just got a little shoulder to kind of cook into the edge, and I use my octagonal reamer and just force that outwards a little bit. And then we're going to use the paddle to flatten the back of that. So if we've done our job right, it should be relatively flat now and ready to accept some color. Just trying to make sure everything's flat and straight. Usually I'm crouching next to my workbench to try and judge that the piece is rotating evenly and straight on the end of that handle. So now we're headed to the kiln, and I'm gonna prep up a little bit of galaxy to put on the back of that piece. I often like to just glob a bunch of color on the back of a pendant, so condensing a little piece before we try and put it on is pretty important. It gives me enough glass that I can force it outwards and not have to stay in the flame and worry about heating up the back side of that pendant too much before I go ahead and squish the back flat. So now I'm gonna heat until the back side of that honeycomb starts to glow ever so slightly, but the color's gonna be ripping hot. And then I push that on there, rotate in the flame for a couple turns, and then peel that rod away so that I can just focus on making sure that glob heats nice and evenly. And once I have it evenly hot and rotating pretty much on center, I'll let it hang, get over my little graphite plate on the workbench, and press it against the workbench. So you can see that color expand right here. And if you've done that just right, you've pretty much trapped the whole back side of that honeycomb we've made. And then you can kind of move on to condensing and evening anything out. There will always be a bit of a wave at the edge of the color on this step, and then I try and melt that until any acute angles disappear. So get another push on the marber there. Starting to be able to see the pattern as the glow diminishes right here. You can see that pattern, the honeycombs starting to show. It's really easy to see once you back it with a nice dark color. So now the process of getting that to elongate and round into a marble begins. So I'm gonna heat the back side of that, and we're really using gravity at this point to try and bring that into a more of an oblong shape. And then I will force it a little bit now and again with the marble mold just like this, but this is a step I often don't do until much later. That was not really necessary at that point. But now got the Bravo flame going, really trying to get an even heat in there. And we're trying to avoid heating the handle too much. If we let too much heat hit the handle, it'll allow the marble to fall out of like true rotation. And if it's not rotating really straight, it really will start to condense in an odd way. And right now I'm not using my paddle to press. I'm really just kind of letting it droop onto the plate. I don't want anything to fall too quickly at that point. So I'm gonna actually switch axis right here. So I'm preparing a little handle with some color on the end. Rather than using a whole color rod to punty up to the backside of that piece, I want a little color on the end of the rod. That way I don't leave any clear behind when I peel this away. Yeah, just kind of getting it stuck on there, making sure everything's straight. And then I'll flame cut that away so we can start to use gravity to elongate the lens of the marble. Marble making really has a lot to do with changing your axis quite a few times, especially once you're at the end and you're rounding things out. So now you can really see, had a chance to let that backside cool down a little bit. The silver's starting to show. Yeah, just heating that little scrap glass and picking it away so that we can make sure that nothing but the original glass from the honeycombs left. And anytime you leave remnants of a handle on the lens of a marble, you can see it later. It'll often cast a shadow in some lighting. Even if you've made the piece perfectly round, you can see a ring of a shadow on the pattern and if things are lit up properly. But now we're just going back and forth from heating the shoulder of the glass and then moving towards the tip of the piece so that we can direct the glass from the edge to the end of the lens. This kind of oscillating back and forth between heating the glass from the edges that you want to bring towards the top of the marble and then heating where you want the glass to go. Back and forth allows you to continue to move that glass. Now that I've had a chance to make a pretty decent dome on that side of the marble, I'm going to handle up to that side again. Like I said, just repeatedly changing axis to make nice round objects. So trying to get right on the center of that marble, flame cutting that handle away that was attached to the color side. And now that we've had a chance to thicken the lens half of the marble, it's going to give us a little bit more glass to set heat into for rounding out the colored half. I'm just picking away the last of that handle just to make sure there's no scrap glass and no evidence of that handle once we finish up the marble. Now I'm getting some heat in there, and once again this is a process of getting that shoulder, the edge warm, and then heating right where you want the glass to go, so right at the back side. And you can use rotation and gravity to force the glass to kind of fall into place, and then back and forth from the marble mold like you are right now, you see that I'm right on the side trying to push the equator of the like two halves inwards. That'll start to condense the marble nicely. So I'm gonna end up getting this end nice and round. Once again, this is just a process of making sure you heat up that half and trying not to heat up your handle too much. If you let the flame splash around to the handle, it can definitely make things fall out of center and deform that half of the marble when you've already made a nice circle on that side. There I am using the handheld marble mold. It's a little bit more of a crisp edge than the mic close marble mold that I have sitting on the workbench, and often helps me kind of form these smaller marbles a little faster. So here I've got a color tip punty again. Now that that marble's nice and round on that half, I use that color tip punty. This is even more important at this point, just so that you don't leave any clear glass behind on that backing color. So flame cutting that off of there. We're almost round, so this is the part where we're going to start really paying attention to exactly how perfect the sphere is. I'm going to pick away that little nipple there that was the last handle, and as I start to round this out, I'm going to start holding up the marble and looking at it kind of against my shop light. So here I am trying to get that. I'm really trying to get the exact center of the marble as I drop it into the marble mold on the edge. So that way it kind of doesn't push the glass away from or towards the center. It just kind of keeps that sphere nice and round. And there I am. I cracked that off in the marble mold. This is my personal favorite way to change axis on my marbles. It gives me a chance to handle up carefully and just kind of make sure everything hangs nice and center. And then I'm going to be watching right for that edge where the color moves over to clear. That's the two different glasses will kind of flow differently, so you're really watching for any waves in the glass right there. And now that we're almost a perfect sphere, I'm starting to speed up in the marble mold. It's a bit easier to work at a bit faster pace once the whole marble is nice and round. And here I am inspecting the marble for like being perfectly round. I'm looking for low spots against the little line from my LED light bar. So you can see that line just in the top side of that marble right now. And I'm, like I said, looking for any waves and low spots. You'll see the little line from that light bar kind of wave if there's any imperfections on the surface of the glass. Now we're gonna handle up again. Once again, like working these cold seals, you really want the marble to be fairly warm, but not warm enough for that handle to push in on the sphere that you've already made nice and round. You can definitely create a low spot by handling up to the marble when it's too hot, and then you're just going to have to work that side again. So, the less you can deform the marble at this point, the better. So we're working on progressively cooler and cooler handles. Now I've got a color tipped punty again. This one's probably going to be my very last handle. I do like to polish up the lens of the marble last. So here we are handling up to the color. The black is a little stiffer, so it doesn't like to deform the way the clear can sometimes. And now I'm just gonna heat up that lens and make sure that it has no blemishes whatsoever, no little waves from dipping it into the marble mold a little too hot, and just inspect that there's no oddness to the way it magnifies. Every so often, if you have a low spot or a bit of a blemish from the marble mold left on the lens of your marble, it'll really create an optical deformity to the pattern that you have inside the marble. So perfect surfaces is what I'm looking for. There you can see that little light bar. easy to find any waves with that. There we go, cracking that off. This is the last one. I keep that on an angle so I can kind of direct it towards my torch. We're going to polish out that last punny mark. Really want to flash that pretty quick. You don't want to stay in the heat too long. I don't want to have that heat flatten out that side of the marble either. Grab my tongs. They've got some fiberglass on some barbecue tongs there, and that really helps soften the pickup. There we go. Got that nice little honeycomb in there. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I really had a lot of fun shooting this tutorial. This is the shorter version. I have a full hour-long edit of this. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.